Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of the Fulcrum Global Podcast, where friends and peers get together to discuss and brainstorm issues and trends relating to the fields of national security, defense, intelligence, and foreign affairs. I'm Sam Kessler, the host and chief editor of Fulcrum Global, which is part of the Society for Defense and Strategic Studies at American Military University. I am excited to be presenting our next guest, but before we get started, if you're interested in with Fulcrum Global, check out our website at fulcrumglobal.us, and you'll see a lot of articles and intelligence briefs, think pieces, background reports, a resource library on a wide range of areas of national security, defense, intelligence, foreign affairs, and career-related stuff. And further ado, let's get started. Our first guest today is Carl C.J. Unis. He is a systems engineer with the United States Space Force in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He has a master's degree in systems engineering from the Stevens Institute of Technology. The degree is focused on systems engineering practices and systems of systems methodology, subcomponent architecture, and systems design. His main area of concentration is systems complexity and cascading failures of enterprise systems. He has more than 20 years of professional experience in various disciplines. He is a subject matter expert in continuity of operations, continuity of government, devolution, infrastructure, and supply chain logistics. Mr. Unis spent more than 10 years at Sandia National Laboratory as a systems engineer. At Sandia, he performed complex systems analysis for the Department of Energy, Department of Defense, and other government agencies. He also performed complex systems analysis for the intelligence community, cybersecurity, emergency response, physical security, and alternative energy divisions at Sandia during his tenure. He has performed complex supply chain logistics analysis and the consequences of disruptions in enterprise systems. Mr. Unis is a U.S. Marine Corps veteran. He served from 1997 to 2001. His duties included motor transport operations, quality assurance, record recovery operations, performing internal embassy security duties to include classified material security, dignitary protection for 2 Secretary of State visits, collaborating with senior embassy security officials on security issues at the embassies in Helsinki, Finland, and Mexico City, Mexico. CJ, it's a real pleasure to have you on. I know we've been trying to have this podcast for a good while now, but I'm very happy to have you on, and I hope we're going to have you again some more times too, because you're an interesting guy, and for what you do, you're very down to earth. I'll tell you that.
Well, thanks, Sam. I appreciate the number one. I appreciate the invite, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys.
Well, it's a real pleasure, and you wrote a very important piece for Phalanx Magazine. And for those of you who don't know what it is, it's presented by the Military Operations Research Society, or MORS, and it's a big national security analysis type of organization. You may want to go more into detail about that, but your paper is very timely. And we were just talking about where really ties in not just with your work at Space Force, but in other elements of the national security enterprise.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the paper was mainly written for Space Force, but the applicability is across almost every domain space within the Department of Defense, the Defense Industrial Base, and now the SID. So the SIB, SIB, Space Industrial Base. So those are important things. But all of the underlying themes that I talk about are not new things. The biggest problem is within DoD, we've been operating, I like to call them cylinders of excellence, AKA stovepipes, because of the fact that we have a lot of folks that are very, very specialized in their field. But I think the bigger issue that we're dealing with here is these problems. They're interconnected, they're interdisciplinary, they're multidimensional systems, architecture, and infrastructure problems. And as we progress here with regard to technology, we are literally moving at the speed of technology right now. And if you look at some of the stuff that has occurred in the last 5 years, there's been an exponential turn in the way in which we view technology, the way information is shared, the way information is passed, and all of the different pieces and parts that kind of make up not only the defense industrial base, but the space industrial base as well. So looking at these problems through a different lens and opening up that aperture, I believe, is critically important to the future of space, the future of DoD, and the future of the intel fields.
For current professionals and then aspiring professionals, what do you think is the best way to prepare for this new environment? Because like, you've mentioned in the past, what you do is very multidisciplinary in many ways. And we talk about elements of linear and nonlinear perspectives, or inside or outside the box, or any of that. A lot of the issues we're seeing today, it's not new. It's like you said earlier, it's years in the making, but now people are realizing, well, we need to start looking at our systems and how we can really improve upon them, or innovate new ones, or upgrade, or, it's a different type of mindset. I mean, if you look at people who are entrepreneurs or innovators, they're always thinking about how they're going to improve something, or how they're going to create a system that works well, and, the type of environment, how it can adapt within it. So how do people prepare for that?
Yeah, that's a great set of questions, Sam, and thanks for asking them. So I think some of the bigger things that aren't being looked at either in industry or with the C-suite or within government have a lot to do. A good friend of mine, Benita Lee, who I did an interview with earlier, she was doing a book club review, and I think the bigger thing here is, this isn't a discipline problem. This is a thinking problem. And I think the way in which people have been trained, the way in which they view problems, the way in which they address problems, it's all cognitive, and it's a human factor. And I think the bigger problem with that is here, they're looking at the problem in a very linear fashion. The problem is, these are nonlinear problems across every discipline and every interconnectivity that you could possibly imagine. So the way we have to think and address these problems is now exponentially compounded over a multitude of domain spaces, because a lot of these folks have been trained to look at the problem a certain way. We need to start opening up the aperture and cleaning off that lens and looking through a different lens of the problem if we're going to be successful with regard to future activities in intel, in DoD, in space, and all of those other domain spaces that are required to assist the defense industrial base and every other organization or community that's out there.
It really seems like you really have to think far in advance to see what the environment is versus what it's heading towards. And if you're going to create that type of way of looking at things, how does one try to look at far ahead if everything is nonlinear? Because I think a lot of people in linear world see things in a straight line, but then you're now in a nonlinear world. You still have to try to have some kind of vision, foresight, or, an idea of how things are evolving. So non-linearly, how do you prepare for the long term? Is that even possible?
No, it's actually the realm of the possible. But a lot of people look at this problem as an impossibility, and I would say quite the contrary. There are 5 foundational pillars that I assert in any enterprise system with regard to how things operate, and those are operations, infrastructure, systems, human capital, and cyber. And those are the 5 foundational pillars that drive any enterprise organization whatsoever. And those 5 things are critically important to any enterprise running, period. And that needs to be looked at as a holistic system, or a holistic systems, or ecosystems of ecosystems architecture. So once you start looking at how these things behave or developed, and looking at some of the case studies of previous failures and what happened, you start looking at some of these things and go, man, are these lessons learned, or are they lessons observed? More times than not, they're lessons observed. And that is really the crux of why we continue to repeat the problems of the past. And in my paper, I talked about, I quoted Hegel, the German philosopher. We learn from history that we don't learn from history, and he couldn't be more right about that. The pure definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So for the most part, you've got some issues here that need to be dealt with, and they need to be looked at through a different lens. Again, One of the things that I look at with regard to emergency management, you've got this umbrella of probably 20 to 30 different disciplines. And when you have a natural disaster, we can speak to what happened in Kentucky. The way, an F5 tornado, 250 miles long, blew through 4 states in a matter of hours and did some major, major destruction. But all of the things in our physical world are complex, they're interconnected, they're volatile, and they're fragile. So when you see all of those things failing, all of the things in our physical world are connected to each other in some way, shape, or form. And that's the way we have to think about the problem, because if you don't, then you're setting yourself up for longer term and broader term failure, because of the fact that a lot of people don't think like that. We have to start thinking like that because technology is forcing us to think like that. And it's critically important that we look at the things that drive the things that we do in our physical world every day, i.e. the underlying infrastructure that supports everything we do. It's great when we have it. It's really horrible when we don't. And a lot of people aren't thinking that far down the road for the simple fact that they assume that it's always going to be there. So electricity, water, wastewater, transportation systems. And if COVID-19 has shown us anything, they've definitely proven that sometimes those things aren't going to be there. And we need to understand what plan B looks like in order to execute the mission accordingly.
Yeah. One thing about is history. I think it's very important to know all times of history in order to look at it from the current scenario. I mean, what you just said, I immediately started thinking of the downfall of the Western Roman Empire, where you have an East and West, and the Western Empire collapsed. You still had the East, but over time, all those systems that you talked about in terms of maintaining the sanitation or keeping things going, that collapsed. There were no longer enough people to really maintain it. No more like engineers and maybe privately or individually you saw some elements of that, but as an entire system, it just collapsed there. And I think that's a big concern. And I think a lot of people don't think of systems as, part of how their life runs, but it does.
You couldn't be more right. And that's what's critically important. So when you start taking a systems view as to how you go about addressing a lot of these problems, your personal aperture is opened up, and you start looking at, well, how can I be personally more resilient in the things that I do, and how can my organization be more resilient? Because I can guarantee you there's a lot of folks in the C-suite that don't necessarily understand how these problems propagate. Is this RCA? Is this root cause analysis? Are we addressing the symptom, or are we addressing the cause? And more times than not, it's the symptom, when we should be looking at the root cause of how we got to this point in the first place. And we have a lot of folks in leadership positions that aren't looking at it like that. And that can be very troubling and frustrating from the standpoint of, we've got some situations that we need to deal with, not only in government, but in industry and the private sector. And we got to get folks to start working together to understand that all of these problems are connected. I don't care where you are in the world, these things are critically important, and they all are run off of some system that was designed by an engineer at some given point in time. So now we start talking about spatial and temporal activities, why these things are important, the if-then construct. If I do this, what are the positive and negative cascading consequences of the decisions that I'm making? And as you can imagine, we've had instances in natural disasters with regard to hurricanes where you have a bad decision on top of a compounding, cascading, wicked problem, that once you have a bad decision, you've exponentially increased the way in which the system is going to react to that bad decision.
Yeah. And like you said, you need to have people collaborating. And something you mentioned in your article about the need for policymakers and people in the operations aspect to collaborate and communicate about what has to be done to fix it. And that's actually something that was briefly discussed in the last podcast with Hans Mumm from a technology perspective too. But it seems like a recurring issue in terms of how to get the policy and operations together to fix it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the bigger thing here is there has been a disconnect, Sam, in that community for years, where you've got folks who have got tacit knowledge that they have the ability to kind of articulate the problem. But when it gets rafted up to the policymakers, there's a total disconnect because the policymakers are like, oh, they'll figure it out, or they have this preconceived notion of, oh, everything's going to be okay. And I can bet you, I would be willing to make a pretty hefty bet that these folks are not engaging with operations personnel, or those operations folks are not at the table when this policy is being created. And that is part of the problem, not part of the solution, because those folks in ops would be able to help those policymakers flush out those problems very, very quickly, because they have tacit knowledge of the system. They operate the system every day. They know the strengths and weaknesses of that system and can potentially assist those policymakers in their ability to design with that constant feedback loop in mind.
Okay. Do you think, or from an operations perspective, I'm trying to loop back to Space Force, because in your article, you also mentioned some examples like the spaceship, the Challenger and the Columbia disasters, as well as the ransomware attacks. You're talking about you have to really prove that the systems or the infrastructure is set up so that, since you're not, if it's something put up in space, you can't exactly replace it that easily. So
absolutely. Yeah. So it has to be flushed out on the ground, because once it goes into LEO, low Earth orbit, or geosynchronous orbit, it's a one and done thing. So we don't have the luxury of being able to fix the problem yet, I will say yet, with regard to how a satellite might get fixed, or an asset up there, an experimental asset may get fixed. But systems thinking needs to be a part of this equation, because again, you see it in the military, you see it in industry. Everybody has their little piece of how they want to deal with the problem, but we have an integration problem, and it needs to be addressed as such, because we have a lot of folks that are real happy in their lane, but they don't necessarily understand how that other individual's system or policy or procedure will impact their lane in some way, shape, or form. And we really, really need to start figuring that out really, really quick, because the folks at SpaceX, the folks at Virgin, and the folks at Blue Origin, they don't have any bureaucracy per se, government bureaucracy per se, inhibiting their ability to innovate. And we have 20th century policy that's driving 21st century innovation. And as you know, that's a huge problem, and it needs to be addressed immediately.
yeah, well, like you said, there's a lot of private actors wanting to be more involved in space. And then you also have other great powers looking to get very involved in it, and they already are. I mean, the last couple of months, we've heard some big news clips about whether it's regarding hypersonic missiles or exploding a missile in space, creating a degree of space debris. And I'm sure there's a few other examples you could add, but in terms of creating a system, how do you prepare for that kind of scenario if you have adversaries, or if you have private actors trying to, have a piece of the space pie and, or impact your abilities to utilize it? How do you create systems that look at that type of scenario, I guess, because you're dealing with a great amount of tensions. I mean, like you said, 20th century policy and 21st century. And how do you get the people on the same page length to look at from that perspective if they are trying to really get Space Force and to protect all the assets we have out there?
Sure. Yeah, I think the bigger thing here, Sam, is the ability to inform and educate, not scare and intimidate. Because, quite frankly, there's a lot of complexity, and there's a lot of systems in this equation. And I think the bigger thing here is to think in systems and capabilities, and not shiny things. We have plenty of shiny things, and that's been clearly demonstrated in the DoD world. The bigger issue here is understanding, if we start thinking in systems and capabilities and investing in people, and having that feedback loop to be able to recognize these folks have got some great ideas. How do we go about implementing that, or how do we get leadership to listen to some of the ideas that, although maybe out of the box, may actually innovate and actually work to our advantage to look at some of these broader issues that we're trying to address, not only in space, but on the ground as well.
And you mentioned how your piece really ties in with other elements of national security enterprise, with systems in the intelligence community or at DoD or uh, Homeland Security. And, it really ties into that. Um, so it goes back to what we were bringing up earlier. For those trying to look at it from a linear versus a non-linear way of thought, um, I think, I've had talks with you and other people, and it's a concern because of the type of strategic reality we're in terms of, both abroad and at home. And, one of the things you talk about is supply chain logistics. And that ties into everything because people are used to working with, a certain system, but if it gets disrupted, it means people are not going to get this or that or build this or that because the materials are somewhere else, or you have a conflict preventing access to it. So you have to find new sources. And I guess the question is, what are the biggest supply chain issues you're tracking? I guess the question is, because from a Space Force perspective or national security enterprise, um, what's the biggest concern that you see from that perspective?
I think there have been some things recently in the news that have been really, really important, i.e. computer chips, or the ability to manufacture computer chips is a really big deal. Toyota has done a very, very interesting job of building their own internal resiliency with regard to the manufacture of chips. And I posted something on LinkedIn with regard to Toyota. They went back to full production December 1st. Well, how did they do that? I started asking myself that question, and I kind of threw that out there to some of the folks that follow me who are in the auto business. And I came to the conclusion one of two things happened. They either partnered with a fab to manufacture chips, or Toyota, in their infinite wisdom, they just went and bought an entire factory because they have the capital to do so. I mean, these guys have got trillions of dollars in the coffers. So they're just like, we have a computer chip problem. We buy a computer chip factory. It's pretty simple. So the fact of the matter is, and I asserted that in the first quarter or the second quarter of 2022, Toyota will be the number one manufacturer of automobiles in the world again, because they have a competitive advantage because of the infrastructure and the resiliency that they have created in their organization to create that one thing that everybody's looking for right now, are computer chips. So again, this is a perfect example of what happens when you've got some outside of the box thinkers who really need to address the problem, but now they are taking it into a different domain. Well, we need to buy a fab facility that supports it. We can't build one fast enough, so let's acquire one and give them whatever they want for it because we have the capital to do it. And then we start manufacturing chips again and go into full production with our automobiles. So it's a perfect example of cause and effect. Well, we don't have chips. We need chips. Let's buy a fab, and then we get to go back and solve a really major problem that we're addressing right now.
Yeah, well, and if I were Toyota, I'd probably look at, we invested in something during a crisis in terms of where there's shortages, and just buying a chip factory is probably going to open up some new opportunities for them too, I would imagine. I mean, when you think about it, if they have the access to chips to a factory, you could probably see some kind of a relationship with, I mean, I'm just speculating, but
Absolutely.
I mean,
Yeah, no, makes total sense, Sam. And I think the other important thing that is these problems aren't new either. So if you go back and look at what was going on in the Second World War with the Office of Strategic Services and the Army Air Corps, when you look about all of the bombing that went on over Germany, they were bombing manufacturing facilities, and they were bombing ball bearing plants. And like, why are they hitting those things? Because the OSS, which is now the Central Intelligence Agency, knew that if you could take out the defense industrial base, the infrastructure that supported the lifeline to the front line, you had the ability to win the war. This is no different, except it exists in business, it exists in the defense industrial base, and it now exists in the space industrial base. So all of these things are critically important, but you have to take a systems approach to the way in which you're going to address these problems, because you're only addressing a small sliver of a very, very broad piece of the thing that you are trying to accomplish. And it needs to be looked at like that. So that's kind of my 2 cents on that subject.
Yeah, well, when you compare that to Germany during the war, I think, first of all, they had all those factories and industries. It was within their sphere of influence too. It may have been in other countries too, but it was still nearby. And we're dealing with a different scenario where, supply chains, everything's interconnected. And what may have been in the US at one point is somewhere else, could be China or it could be some other country. And if it's disrupted, it really makes us reassess what has to be brought home, or at least within our sphere of influence, where it's easily manageable. I guess that seems to be a big discussion people are having.
Yeah, and to your point, Sam, they're looking at bringing manufacturing back to the United States, because obviously the supply chain isn't as long. The whole just-in-time to market is alive and well as well. And looking at bringing your supply chain back into something that you can control is very important too, because everybody wanted it cheaper, faster, better. But when you look at long-term with regard to goods and services and things being produced, you want to make sure that the good or service that you are providing to folks has a very small distribution supply chain with regard to how are these subcomponents getting to me? Do I have to rely on third parties to do stuff? So I think it's really, really important that folks in the C-suite and folks in industry and the private sector and government are having to reinvent themselves, because if the last 24 months has shown us anything, the systems that we operate in are extremely fragile. And we need to change that narrative quickly in order for us to be number one again in the world.
Yeah, well, and I guarantee you other countries are figuring the same thing out too, because their systems have been disrupted. Although, is there any comparing how other countries' systems have been affected by all of this, or
it's safe to say, Sam, that everybody at every corner of the globe has been impacted in some way, shape, or form, because we are in a global economy now. It just didn't used to be the United States or Japan or Germany or North or South America. We're in a worldwide economy now. And those disruptions were felt far and wide. A perfect example would have been the Ever Given that went through the Suez Canal and ran aground. Again, you're talking $500 billion a day in economic impact through that canal alone. But when you're talking about goods and services that are that are slated for just-in-time production, now you're talking 2 to 3 week delays, and that is exponentially compounded depending on what type of good or service was on any of those ships. And the Ever Given alone had $50 billion worth of economic impact. One ship. There are 30 to 40,000 containers on a single ship. We're calling these, mega container ships. $50 billion on one ship is an excessive amount of money. But the raw materials that were on that ship were destined for the United States. And if you have one ship with that kind of economic impact, imagine the hundreds of ships that are out at sea that have the ability to cause that amount of economic impact as well. And that is a supply chain problem, but it's also distribution and raw materials and ecosystems of ecosystems architecture. And that really hits home on a multitude of different fronts. And it needs to be addressed like that, because they're like, oh, there's just stuff on a ship. Well, that stuff on that ship has a tremendous amount of economic impact, and it needs to be addressed as such. So resiliency needs to be built into the system to understand that these things are going to cause ripple effects across many streams and many narratives and many industries if they are disrupted.
That's right. And, even though maybe you said 50 billion worth of, goods on there, right? So
that had been paid for too.
Right.
So
paid for, but when it's in the market's place, it's probably going to be a lot higher, I would imagine, too. So the cost is the cost is huge. That's the thing. And from a supply chain perspective, there are people who I follow who have been talking about, well, there's a shortage of this, or it could be also with, gas or oil or rare earth minerals or other things. But the centrality of the choking points, I guess, people, I think it seems like people really have to look at from that perspective. I mean, I remember back in the summer, there was a big fire in Illinois, and it was a lubricant plant. And they made the largest amount of lubricants in North America, I believe, or North and South, I can't remember, but they were expecting that this would create a major shortage down the road, and that impacts everything from cars and infrastructures and stuff.
Yeah, and ironically enough, I actually posted an article on that regarding to why you need specialty grease in your life, and it's an indirect thing, but it's part of the supply chain. So when you have specialty lubricants and specialty oils that are powering these 18-wheelers and making sure that they stay lubricated, the pintle hook that goes into the trailer on the 18-wheeler has to be constantly greased. If those specialty greases cease to exist, where does that necessarily leave the truck driver? Pretty much dead in the water, because those lubricants are responsible for getting those 18-wheelers from point A to point B. So those are inject points into a complicated and complex system, i.e. transportation, that drive commerce across this country. And without those specialty lubricants, goods and services don't get to market. And that's a perfect example of that very thing. So again, these are things that we always take for granted because the assumption is that they're always going to be there until they're not. So this is another important thing that needs to be considered with regard to how things function in our physical world and the resiliency that needs to be created around those potential single points of failure that drive the ability for it to function or for it to not function.
So from a trend perspective, do you think people will eventually realize that their systems have to be updated or evolve? Or is it just going to be, I mean, from the area you work, do you see that there's a lot of really good movement going, or do you feel like it's still, people are still figuring things out?
I'm of the opinion that people are still trying to figure things out because these things are complicated and they are complex. And I don't think enough of this from the university standpoint is being taught, because we have folks in acquisition, we have folks in systems, we have folks in operations who quite frankly aren't talking to each other. And that narrative, Sam, needs to change. It absolutely needs to change in order to be successful and in order to be resilient in the national security construct, because we've got a lot going on. I mean, I'm not going to lie. There's some things that need to be changed, but it needs to be changed from a policy standpoint, and we need to get our policymakers to understand these problems are complicated and they are complex, and they need to be addressed as such. And there needs to be a technical injection of subject matter expertise into these areas to frame the problem and to help folks understand that these actions have consequences.
Mm-hmm. It almost seems like there needs to be a course. I don't know if there is to add any of that type, but to teach people how to interact with people from the different aspects of a field. Maybe there's something. I mean, like in the world of intelligence, you have different types of intelligence analysts, and you have the all source, you have the targeting analysts, and you have a process where a lot of people do get together and try to look at the analysis from different angles, and then someone ties it all together, and then it turns into a nice little product. That's a lot of work, and from what you
It
do,
is.
that's probably even 10 times more intense, because you're dealing with a lot of different people from different fields, and you have to make sure people are on the same page. Um,
Yeah.
so, I mean, what's the average day? The type of scenario, like you tend to do a lot of different scenarios. I mean, a different type of disciplines, or they're tied, interrelated together. How do you stay sane when that happens?
Oh boy, that's a great question. I think education is part of that process, and I think it's critical that talking about some of these problems and they're vocalized, not only from an ops standpoint, but an engineering standpoint and a policy standpoint. And the policies that are being creative, they have impacts. They have impacts on engineering. They have impacts on operations. They have impacts to the mission. But again, I see it time and time again when you have folks that are making decisions that don't understand the engineering perspective and the policy perspective and the potential funding perspective on what does a palm process look like, and why are those things critically important to, if we're going to do this, we need money to do it. We need to sustain our infrastructure. We need to make sure our infrastructure is resilient, because if we don't have infrastructure, we don't have a mission. So being able to look at all of those things in a holistic manner, I believe, is critically important to not only our current success, but our future success as well. And not enough of that is being done. And there aren't enough systems integrators in this equation to help with that, because we are manpower starved right now, because of the fact that we are moving so fast with technology, and all these new opportunities are being created to allow us to be successful.
Do you think the trend to work more remotely, do you think that's going to make it harder, or will it make it easier, or is it just a wash, do you think?
Well, I can tell you, the remote part of doing classified work, that's not happening. That's a non-starter. So you've got to physically be in a building to do stuff, because I don't see that going away anytime soon with the way the current system is designed. So it's critically important to understand that these things aren't trivial. But again, we have to maintain some level of classification on these missions that are occurring for national security purposes. So I'm pretty convinced that that's not going to change. But the way in which we work, the way in which we go into work, may not be the frequency that it used to be, where you have to be in an office every day. I mean, we're having a conversation right now over a network, and you and I are conversing. You're on the other side of the country. I'm in Albuquerque. So this is just a perfect example of the timeliness of travel and being able to get things done much quicker through being enabled through technology. It's great when it works. It's not so great when it doesn't.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting when you say that, because I think going back to trying to get people on the same page part, um, I think first of all, I think what you do, I can understand. I mean, I'm an interdisciplinary guy. I mean, I don't profess to be an expert at anything, but I try to understand things better. And I saw that you did another talk with someone earlier this week, and really what came across, what really made me realize is, a lot of people, because I think it was you, I think you mentioned it. A lot of people, it's like you say something, it sounds like intimidation. It sounds intimidating, because a systems engineer, what is that? I mean, when I think of systems and engineer, I think of maybe computers and engineering, like, building a smart app or something, or a robot or something. But it it if you get beyond the outer shell, it makes a lot of sense. And I think a lot of people have to look at things from like a systems perspective, like you talked about, And I mean, it ties into everything from entrepreneurship or innovating, and um, you could also say statecraft or building a society. I mean, you got to have a society that has a system that works well, and people have, XYZ surface. And it ties into a lot of stuff. It's similar concepts. And that, I get the sense, is like, you look at it from that type of a big picture. So, it's, I guess the thing is, I think a lot of people have to embrace a lot of the concepts and try to understand. It's actually fairly simple when you look at it from those angles, I guess. And so, yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you're right over the target on that, Sam. And I think it's really important with regard to how we address problems. But again, there are certain entities within society that absolutely have to have resiliency in them. Sort of like when we're doing resiliency for a community. There's a couple things that are for small communities when we were looking at how we go about addressing some of the problems after a natural disaster. Well, money is always an important thing, and money will always be an important thing. ATM machines, um, uh, access to banks, access to a pharmacy, a CVS or a Walgreens or something along those lines, where people have their meds, grocery store, being able to self-sustain through food and whatnot. But those are just some small examples of when you're planning resiliency for a community. What does that look like? And if you need a generator at those facilities to sustain those facilities when bad stuff happens, it's looking at the problem more broadly. And what happens if the power grid goes down? Because electricity, quite frankly, kind of powers the world. But the fragility of the grid is also an issue too. So looking at those things are important. But if you have the ability to think beyond that singular problem, the cascading effects of those entities not existing are probably going to cause a lot of chaos in the community. And looking at those problems more succinctly, more broadly, and who they impact. And you're talking city planners, you're talking politicians, you're talking about folks in policy, you're talking about your operations component. It basically is something that makes a community run. And without those things, the community doesn't function. Emergency management people, police, fire, EMS. What happens if their infrastructure network goes down? Their ability to respond to emergencies and civil unrest comes into question. So, I mean, we can talk about all of these things. The same applies to the military. It's no different. So these are all things that are systems based, and our physical world is based on systems. And we need to get people to think more broadly and more deeply about those problems and how they come about, and who needs to get involved in some of these conversations, either it be from the operations world, from academia, from government, all of those things. But they're all interconnected in some way, shape, or form. And we need to do a better job of making sure that folks are communicating with each other in those domain spaces.
Well, I would also add, especially from personal experience, that it has to be taken seriously when it does happen. Because I will say, if you recall, there was a blackout in New York City in 2003, and I was there. I was actually there, and I remember I had a day off or something, and I was in a movie theater on 34th Street, and I was watching a movie. I think it was like 28 Days Later, which ironically, power goes out after 20 some minutes, and next thing I know, I see all these people on the streets because people are getting kicked out of the stores so they can lock down and everything. Everyone was trying to call their cell phones, but no one could because of too much activity. And fortunately, I went to my building, and that was back then. You still had some telephone booths left over, but I was trying to figure out what was going on. And so I called my parents. Have you heard anything about this? But if there was no telephone booth, I don't know if I would have ever been able to call my parents, and they would wonder like, what's going on with him. So, and the thing is, I would say when that happened, I would, I think New Yorkers, when that type of stuff happens, they're very calm. I mean, for the most part, from my experience, they're very calm and, just dealing with the situation at that time. And
Yeah,
probably September 11th was still pretty, uh, you know, in the people's minds. But I would say, when I think especially in the world we live in now, it's, I think people have to realize, well, what are you going to do if that happens? Like you said, have a system and level of seriousness, and one of the things you focus on is with continuity, and whether it's operations or what was it, continuity of,
continuity of operations, also known as COOP, or continuity of government, COOG, or continuity of business.
yeah,
So it's basically being able to have a hypothetical tabletop exercise and look at some of the gray areas and the disconnects in your organization that are critically important to sustaining operations, through the boom or through the natural disaster, to make sure that if you have a mission critical environment, or you have a mission critical good or service that you're providing, you're able to sustain through those problems. And looking at some of the gaps that you might have in your organization is critically important to the resiliency and the sustainability of that company or that organization.
Mhm. Well, and yeah, those years, when I lived in New York, for part of my New York life, I worked in the financial sector, and that was a period where a lot of the financial firms were moving away from Wall Street and to Midtown, like somewhere on Fifth Avenue in the 40s or 50s. And they thought, well, it's just too dangerous to be in that part of town. But they were also looking to create continuity outside of the city too, in case something were to happen,
Sure.
so that their businesses would continue. But um, I guess the question is, it- in terms of creating continuity, um, what's the best way to start tackling it? Because I mean, do you do a lot of like stress tests or red team analysis, or uh, different types of assessments? Like, I know you could have a
Yeah.
talk a lot about it, but
Yeah, we could probably have a whole nother show about this alone, Sam. So
I know, but it's to but it's also to get people thinking about, how things operate. I mean, just to get like a general idea, but to start
absolutely.
about it.
Yeah, no. So when you're talking about, the continuity of operations for an organization, it's critically important that there are folks that do have COOP plans. You need to brush them off and blow the dust off of them and exercise. So it's a train as you fight mentality. So the more accustomed you become to doing it, the more it becomes second nature. So what would you do if there was an active shooter in a building? Well, it's a shelter in place scenario. There was a hospital. I'm trying to remember what it was. I think it was in Alaska. They had a they had a bear come into their facility. Like, the automatic doors opened up and a bear just wandered in. Holy cow. Um, how would you address that? Well, you would address it as a potential active shooter. It's not a bear, but the same procedure that you would go through as a shelter in place would be the same thing, because you've got this big old black bear, this grizzly bear walking into a hospital facility. Um, I wouldn't want to get mauled by a bear in a hospital, so I would shelter in place. So those are some of the things that you have to consider with regard to, if this situation comes up, am I properly trained to address the situation, and what's going to be my thought process with regard to how I go about addressing the problem?
That's interesting. I think we've been on for about an hour or so. I think
Okay.
something along those lines. But I would like to have you on again. And I know we were going to do this with Dan Opstol, but he wasn't able to make it. But he'd like to be on with you again, because there's a lot of things he focuses on that would really be interested with you and the work you do, and other people, because I mean, we live in interesting times, and the work you do is very relevant. And it's like something that a lot of people, especially if they're in the field or trying to get into the field, they need to have that type of mindset and, look at, how does this apply to the current strategic reality and what's leading to the next strategic reality and all those interesting factors. And there's a lot of things
Yeah,
to think about, but I
absolutely.
hope I hope this helps.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does, Sam. And we can talk more about this in the future. And I think the other important thing is we need to start concentrating on training the next generation of systems thinkers, because quite frankly, we haven't done a terribly great job about it. But the new generation coming up, who are going to be our future leaders, need to have these problems framed in this manner, because their world is going to be so much more complicated and so much more complex than the current world that we're living in. We need to set up and we need to prepare them for that. And this is the first step in making that happen.
Well, first step, and then there'll be another step.
Absolutely.
It's good. Well, on that note, we're going to sign off, and we'll talk to you next time. And I'm sure I'll talk to you some more after this. So
Sure.
CJ, thanks for doing this. I'm glad we finally got this first one set up, and it was a great talk. I really appreciate it.
This is great, Sam. I really appreciate the opportunity, and let's talk about systems some more, because I think there's going to be folks interested in what we've got to say.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode of the Fulcrum Global Podcast. Since this is probably the last one of 2021, I just want to wish you all, on behalf of the team, have a great holiday, have a great Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, Happy New Year, and stay safe, sane, and savvy, because we live in interesting times and there's always more going on than what we may realize. So keep being curious. CJ, thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Sam.